All right, I am delighted to welcome our second panel. The second panel is moderated by Rana Braun, President of Philanthropy New York. This panel is going to share insights about the next generation. How do they look at grant giving, donating? What are their values in terms of all of this, this conversation that we've been having? How are they going to be disrupting this part of the philanthropic world? Rana is president of Philanthropy New York. It's an organization that was founded in 1979 that fosters effective philanthropy through collaboration among its 285 member organizations. And prior to her current role at Philanthropy New York, she served as 9 years as the president and CEO of the Better Business Bureau of Metropolitan New York. Sound familiar? So I have big shoes to fill even after all this time. So Rana will welcome her panel. I want to thank them for being here today. Rana, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. And my thanks to the Better Business Bureau, who has done an incredible job the last 12 years with this particular event that they have every year. It's gotten better and better. And thanks to Baruch for being the host. Obviously, thanks to the panel for coming, and mostly for all of you for taking the time to come together today to go away from your office and understand the importance of having a community conversation. So this panel, Nextgen, those of you who are looking at me, no, I'm not the Nextgen, but we do have two folks on the panel who are Nextgen, and two, myself and one other panelist who aren't. At the end, we'll have a little contest and see if you guys can figure it out. Before we start, though, I want to just find out who's in the room and how you guys identify yourselves. So who in this room, before we give a definition, would say you are part of the next generation of people working in philanthropy, working in the nonprofit sector, or being the donors? Who's next gen? All right, you guys are very special. I feel like we should spread you out among the room. Everybody else take note of who just raised their hands. So who do we have up here? We have Bianca Alston in the middle, board member at Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy. That is a nonprofit membership group creating leaders of the next generation of people working in the field of philanthropy. To my left, Adina Schwartz from 2164. She's the Director of Client Engagement. 2164 is a nonprofit consulting practice focused on multi-generation advising for family philanthropies. And to the far left, my far left, is Gay Young, Vice President of Donor Services at the New York Community Trust, a New York City-based community foundation that I know everyone in this room knows, either because they do fund you or you want them to fund you. So either way. That was a very short, I gave short shrift to all of their bios. So please do look at them in your packet. Before we start our conversation, we want to just make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So what is the next gen and how are we going to be using it on this panel? We are basically merging, and I don't know where these alphabet things came from, but Generation X and Y, the millennials. So we're talking about people who are 21 to 40. That's who we're all talking about as the next generation. That group of people will inherit $40 trillion. $40 trillion. So compare that to the boomer generation, where everyone was, stunned by the number, how big it was, that people have and will continue to inherit about 12 trillion. A huge increase. And that is not counting the money that that generation is going to make. I will say I looked up a couple of different reports. The numbers vary slightly from report to report, but they are approximately those numbers and, consistent within that range. So, with that in mind, I want to ask the panel to start by explaining how they and their organization are thinking about the next generation. And I'm going to borrow from Doug, who used that analogy of the storms in the Midwest. So when you're thinking about the next gen in your office, Are you thinking about an incredibly sunny day in the future, that great sunny day when the Nextgen is fully in charge? Or is it a little more that black-green clouds with the tornado on the horizon? So with that, I'm going to ask Adina to tell us a little bit about how they're thinking about it at 2164. It's obviously core to their work. And maybe if you could give us just a couple of trends that you have gotten from your most recent research.
Sure. Oh, sorry. So 2164 was actually incubated. Is that clear? Can you guys hear me? Out of the Andrea and Charles Bronfman Philanthropies. So Charles Bronfman we like to talk about as one of our favorite Nextgen. He's inheritor to the Seagram's family. He's probably in his mid-80s right now. But essentially, he was creating all of these nonprofit initiatives in Manhattan, and what he realized was that the Nextgen wasn't really joining him in a strategic way in funding the initiatives that he was setting up for them. And so he tasked Sharna Goldsecker, our executive director, to kind of go out and learn about who is the next generation and why aren't we really engaging them in the way that we need to be. Like, they're taking advantage of a lot of our programs, but as funders, they're not really joining us around the table. And that's how 2164 was born. Sharna did a bunch of research, and then we all joined her over the years. And one of the studies that we've become known for is a study in 2013 where we did 300 in-depth interviews with Nextgen inheritors across America, just to learn about what drives them, what makes them tick, how can we engage them in a more effective way. And so I've been asked to share a few of those findings. I'll share them very briefly and then happy to go into more detail as we engage in conversation together. The first, and you've probably heard this a bunch about the Nextgen, is that they're really values-driven. And so when they think about which organizations they want to engage with, one of the first questions they ask us as consultants to help them to make those decisions is, what are the values that we care about? What are the values we inherited from our families? We're dealing very often, majority of the Nextgen we're dealing with or that we work with, our inheritors. So what are the values that we inherited growing up? What are our own unique values? And what are the values of the organizations we're looking to engage with? And how do we make decisions honoring the legacy of those who we inherited the wealth from, but also that in a way that feels fulfilling to us? And so we help them to have that conversation, usually as an entry point. In their decision making around where to engage. The other thing is that they're really more and more thinking about their legacy today. That's actually where our name 2164 comes from. 21 when you come of age, 64 when you start to think about your legacy. But what we're finding is that the next generation is really starting to think about their legacy today, wanting to live their legacy. And so they're asking questions about, where do we want to be when we're 64, right? Like, what do we want to be reflecting on later in our lives? And how can we live that legacy today? And then maybe one third thing I'd share now is just that they're looking to engage beyond we call this at 2164 their 4 T's. So not just their treasure, they're not looking just to think about how they can engage financially with an organization or in support of an organization, but also how they can give of their time. These are generations that volunteer more than any generation that came before them. Their talent, right? They're looking to support organizations with the things that they're good at. So how can they support organizations in ways that are unique to them. And then also ties. They're looking to leverage their resources in support of organizations, their networks in support of organizations that they care about. So if they, those are sort of the 4 T's that they're thinking about: their time, their talent, their treasure, and their ties. And we help them to think about all these different resources they have to give to an organization and how they make decisions about where they want to leverage all of those.
So I'm going to sum that up by sunny day. You're thinking sunny day, right?
Yes, sunny day.
Okay, all right. Bianca, I would love for you to share a little bit of the trends that EPIP has been coming up with. You're sitting here with a little bit of a different hat than the other 2 panelists because you're talking about the generation working in philanthropy, not necessarily the philanthropists themselves, although many will be both. So perhaps you can share a little bit from EPIP's research.
Great, and good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. So as Rana just shared, I'm here obviously wearing several hats, and I just want to share kind of that perspective that I'll be bringing to this conversation, as well as just some information about EPIP for those who are less familiar with the organization and what we do. So first and foremost, you're right if you guessed it, I'm a millennial. I am under 30, and I've been working professionally in philanthropy for 4 years. Right now, I work at a community foundation at the New York Women's Foundation. I also give, so I'll talk more about that later, but it's important that not only do I give to kind of to my values and the things that I care about in the community that I came from, but also my work in philanthropy informs my giving. And the other kind of the biggest hat that I'm wearing as part of this conversation today is my work on the board of EPIP. So I've been, EPIP has 16 chapters nationally, and I've been engaged with the New York chapter as a member for the last 4 years, all 4 years that I've been in philanthropy, but I've just started in my tenure on their National Board of Advisors. That started formally last October. And so EPIP's mission is to empower leaders and elevate philanthropic practice in order to build a more just and equitable, sustainable world. So what does that mean for us? Essentially, it means that we envision a world where people of all identities can live full, prosperous, and lives supported by a diverse, equitable, effective philanthropic sector. What we believe is that our membership is the most diverse group of folks who work in philanthropy, and often those folks are not tapped by the organizations and the foundations that they work for as a valuable resource when they're thinking about both their programmatic strategies and about how they engage with their donors. Although EPIP's core membership is under 40, we serve early and mid-career professionals at any age looking to develop their skills and deepen their understanding of the field. We want senior professionals and philanthropic institutions to be excited by our vision of the sector and work collaboratively with us, with using their wisdom and their breadth of experience so that we can move the sector along together, as opposed to like this fear that folks seem to have that like we just want to come in and take over. Last year, EPIP released its new strategic framework, which we call Powering Change in Philanthropy, which highlighted what we already knew. We are the diversity that we want to see in the field, leading the field one day, and how best to engage with our folks as partners with deep roots in the communities that philanthropy wishes to serve and commitment to social justice and equity. And I will be lifting up some of that, some of their voices as part of this conversation as well.
Thank you. So Gay,
Yes.
how is...
All I was going to say is I'm obviously not the other millennial up here, so.
You guys have just given away all the secrets,
True.
which were otherwise not at all obvious. Okay, so Gay, how is the New York Community Trust thinking about the next generation of donors? What kinds of steps are you taking at this stage just to make sure that you are embracing the next generation and that they see you as the place they can go to?
Well, I have to admit that this is a bit of a challenge for us. I think we were a little slow in recognizing that there was this generational shift occurring. So I feel that some of the steps we're taking are perhaps a little slower than we might have wanted them to be. What I'm seeing is that we have to seriously upgrade our technology. We're talking about a generation that speaks technology. They are digital natives. And I work for an organization that's been around for almost 100 years, and we are not tech savvy. We also tend to be older as a group. Most of the people at the Trust have been there for a very long time, and it's really difficult when you've settled into certain patterns of dealing with people to make a shift. So for us, this is really causing us to think seriously about what we do, how we do it, and how we convey our message. Having said that, we are responding by, for example, introducing online giving. That will happen later on this year, which you have no idea how difficult a measure that is, because we're not used to thinking about people not writing checks or not issuing instructions to their brokers. So the idea that somebody might make a sizable contribution with a credit card has just caused us to really step back and think about what the world is becoming. The other thing that we're doing is we're making sure that the people who come in to talk to us about setting up funds are aware that we are not just talking about taking their money, but we're also talking about educating them so that they can become better philanthropists. I think one of the things that it's very easy to lose sight of is that anyone can give money away. We all give money because a friend asked us to, $50, $100. But becoming a philanthropist is a much more complicated process because it implies that you're knowledgeable and you're thoughtful about what you're doing. And I think that that's one of the strengths of the trust, because even though we've been here a long time, we have expertise in guiding individuals to becoming thoughtful grant makers. So I'm going to stop right now because I think those are just two really important aspects of what we're doing, and I'm sure that we will all. There will be more. There will be more, but I can't say what exactly because, as I said, we're just learning.
So you guys have raised a whole bunch of different themes, and I know that all of you out there are thinking about questions you're going to have too as you think about your own organization moving forward. I want to pull a couple of the themes that we heard earlier on today and talk about them in the context of the next generation and figure out, is there something new, or is it really just a trend that is continuing to evolve? So let's look first at something like impact. Everybody knows impact, evaluation, whichever terms we're going to use, are critically important. It's important to funders, it's important to organizations. When you do some of the reading about research on the next gen, we hear that the next generation cares even more about impact. What does that mean? What are they looking for, and how is it different than what exists today? And I am hoping that between the three of you, you guys can answer that, or at least start giving us some insight. So who would like to start? Go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I actually had a pretty unique opportunity a couple of weeks ago to facilitate a couple of giving circles for a nonprofit organization here in Manhattan. And it just happened to be that one of the giving circles was for a more mature group of donors that they were trying this group, this giving circle method out with, and then a 20s and 30s group. And it was just so interesting because what the session that I helped to facilitate was where we actually brought in some program directors to speak to the group about what their programs were all about and how the giving circle and how the collective funding that the group would make would support these different program areas. And when we talked about impact, it was just wild to see how especially the 20s and 30s group asking questions of the program directors were very, very specific, such that they were looking to understand where each of them put $1,800 into this collective giving circle, and then they had this pot of money to give away, and they wanted to understand how the organization would show them exactly how their $1,800 gift and then their collective gift together would support this program area, as opposed to questions that the more traditional group of donors were asking, which were more just, I guess, about how the program operated, where they needed some overhead support. The 20s and 30s group were looking to really make their gifts restricted and then to track the impact of those gifts over time. And so when we talk about the next gen being impact oriented, I think one thing that we have to do, we talked a little bit about this in the first panel, was to be careful about using buzzwords like that, because what do we mean by impact, right? Are we talking about measuring more immediate outputs, long-term outcomes, root causes of problems? It's a lot harder to address systems, to measure systems change, but often the next gen are talking about wanting to fund systems change, so a lot of that has to do with education and teaching a little bit or learning what they mean by impact so that we can show them the impact that they're looking for.
I think as an institution, this is actually an area where we have an advantage because the trust has been around for a very long time and has thoroughly studied the impact that it's had in a number of areas. So we have a long history of excellent grant making in various program areas. The challenge for us, though, is how we present that information. So we have reports, we have studies, we have knowledge that our program officers have, but how do we get that information in front of the next generation? And I think that one of the ways we do it is through what we call our donor briefings, where we actually invite our donors and their guests to come in and meet the program officers and the experts that they bring with them, and to ask questions and just hear a presentation. But I think one of the things that we really need to improve is how do we do this in a more tech-savvy way. Sometimes we've had the question, well, I can't make this session. Will you do it? Could it be web-based or something like that? And that's not where we are yet. But
where you're going.
Where we're going, yes, we're optimistic. That's where we're going.
Okay.
Sunny day.
Bianca.
So this is always interesting for me. I feel like I float somewhere, and our members kind of float somewhere in the middle. The good thing about having, when you're looking at a potential donor base of younger folks who work in philanthropy, is that they know and absolutely buy into how important it is to give general operating funds. A lot of the folks that I've engaged with who are members of EPIP, and some of our EPIP chapters have even started their own giving circles, are all giving general operating funds, and they understand why that's important to this sector. So that being said, is a combination, I guess, of what both of my fellow panelists have shared, like having the education as and knowing how important general operating funds are as someone who works in philanthropy, and how that informs the way you give is critically important. I think also the other part to remember about the folks in our membership is that their questions will be more about how the kind of like the operationalizing of the organizations, as opposed to like, let me track every dollar that I give you. I'm kind of surprised to hear that. But I think that also comes with just a lack of understanding how the field works in general, which I think is possible for any generation at any age. And it certainly, I have millennial friends who work in philanthropy, and we have these conversations. I also have friends who, in my age group, who don't work in the field at all, have no idea what we do. What any of us do, what I do, what any of us do in the room. And so I think that's certainly a part of it. But, the questions I ask individually as someone who gives is, if you're caring about communities of color, like namely Black women and their families, are there any Black women on staff? Like, were there any Black women a part of the conversation when you were putting this strategy together for funding? Like, those are the kind of things that matter to me, because we know as folks who work in philanthropy how essential, even well-intentioned, some of these programs could be, but without the insight of the communities that we wish to serve, is a lot of these programs kind of fall on their face and be like ineffective.
So I want to follow up a little bit on some of the comments that you were just making and turn to the issue that you raised first, Bianca, in your opening remarks about diversity and equity for the next generation. The next generation is going to be more diverse. We know that, and that is, a thing that we all applaud and welcome. But what does that mean for organizations and for their expectations? And I want to just share, and so I'm pretty traditional. This is a research paper you can find online, sorry. But the Building Movement Project is a terrific organization that did some research about what people across the country in nonprofits think about diversity in their own organization. And they asked people, it was like 1,000 people, a question: is your organization taking racial diversity and gender into account adequately when they promote and support staff? And for those who were not Nextgen, a substantial majority said absolutely. For those who were Nextgen, the number was about half, and they said absolutely not. They are not doing enough. So thinking about those differing perceptions, I think what I want to ask each of you is, how should people both in organizations who want to appeal to a next generation of philanthropists and a next generation of employees, how should they be thinking about ensuring that they understand the value of diversity in the organization? What do they need to do?
Well, I think the trust has an advantage in having me as a person who meets prospects, because I'm obviously the embodiment of diversity in many ways. The challenge, though, we have at the trust is that many of our, as I said, many of us in the leadership, we're older. So the challenge is making sure that we recruit younger program officers and younger people to work with prospects. I think that that's just a matter of time, though, because the fact is we are in the middle of a generational shift, and over time, younger people are going, the replacements are here, and they're starting to come to work, so that will happen.
This is always interesting for me because the idea that we'll like eventually get there, I think, is part of the problem. So I think the lack of intentionality with bringing like newer folks in, and like so our membership are attracted to philanthropy or working in this sector because they see the promise of it. They feel like it is a place where they could kind of stretch their wings a little bit, get familiar, and like live the values that they care about. And often we work at these, especially like the philanthropic organizations and foundations that have these wonderful like visionary like mission statements, and you read it and you get excited and you memorize it for the interview and you just like want to be there. And then once you get there, you're the youngest person in the room, you're LGBTQ, and you're not sure how much you're supposed to bring of that into the space that is often very like constricting. We're wearing suits. I don't really know what to do with this. I still don't wear heels. That's my little rebellion. And just this idea of like, we talk a lot in philanthropy about how we want folks to be their whole selves. We want our grantees to feel like they can be themselves and empower them, but how are we empowering those folks who work at our organizations who are from these communities, and we don't want to hear their voices? Like, it's just contradictory in a lot of ways. I think also, we have the challenges around like race and ethnicity. Those are obviously, more traditional ideas of what we think about diversity, but sexuality is a big part of it. Kind of gender presentation is kind of challenging too, when you have this idea of like what business casual looks like when you're supposed to show up to work every day. But if that's not how you identify, like how much of yourself are you allowed to be, I think is the big question. Also, we have a lot of folks in the membership who are program associates or program assistants that never get the opportunity to grow at philanthropic organizations. We know our folks tend to stay there and get comfortable for a while. And what that means is that this like new generation who is excited and engaging and want to serve these communities are not getting all the opportunities that they need, or even a chance to be in the room to even listen to some of these like kind of those power broking conversations in those tables that really dictate what was going to be allocated to the communities that they care about. So it just has to be an intentionality from the folks who currently work and are in the senior management of these institutions, that they really want to onboard and retain folks. Because the other part of what we're seeing is that people come in, they're excited, and they work there for a couple of years and really just discouraged by how isolated they feel and how the lack of opportunity for growth, and they leave. And that's a really missed opportunity we see.
But Bianca, I think that generational tension has always been around. I mean, the fact is, you go into many traditional fields, you go into law, for example, I think many associates feel like, when are these partners going to move over? I have the good ideas, I can do what they do. So I think some of it is, that's just a natural generational tension where the elders don't want to move over yet. They still feel that they're vibrant, and young people think, move over, my time is here. So we just have to figure out how we can work together so that both needs are met. The need to feel vibrant as an older person is very important, and I don't think that gets enough credit. And the need to feel that you are being groomed and your time will come is important for younger people.
I think that that's such a good point too, just because, we really, when we talk about engaging the next gen, we're not so much talking about a passing of a baton anymore, right? Like the average lifespan 100 years ago was 47, I think. The average lifespan today is 80 something. And so when we talk about next-gen engagement, we're really talking about multi-generational engagement in philanthropy in this case, I guess, right? And really, you could have up to 5 generations over the age of 21 living under one roof, making decisions together. And certainly that's true of our work in the nonprofit sector. And so one thing I'm mindful of is that we spend, at least in my work, a lot of time talking about the next generation, but a lot of these conversations are best addressed by asking questions of the next generation. Absolutely. So if we're mindful of, for example, what diversity they're expecting on the board of the nonprofit that they're engaging with, let's ask them what they're looking for and what will success look like as we're diversifying over the next 5 years. So more to be in conversation with, and they're often looking for those conversations. It can be the best way to engage in Nextgen is to just invite them out. The panelist who was sitting here previously talked about these like dates. Those are the best ways to get to know the next generation, is to take them out and to learn a little bit about what makes them tick, learn about what their values are, and then be mindful of what they're letting you know their values are as you think about how you communicate about your organization to them. So a little bit of a shifting of the dynamic from maybe a little bit more transactional to relational, and taking the time to ask those questions.
And this would be a good moment for all of you to think about the questions you want to ask the folks up here. Write them down, and we'll start looking at those in just a couple of minutes. But first, I want to shift the conversation a little bit and talk about 2 ways in which I think people fear the disruption of the next generation, although there are those who will be embracing it. One of those is new kinds of organizational forms. So whether it's social venture funds or LLCs, or just social entrepreneurs. We know that many of the largest, most significant donors in the next gen are already exploring those forms as a way to be more effective. So is that the future, and what does that mean? Because I think there's a certain amount of fear in the more traditional nonprofit community. What does that mean for all of us? Do we need to make similar kinds of shifts in order to attract the attention of those kinds of donors? Or is there plenty to go around for everyone? And I think what I want to combine with that, if I can, is the way in which that impacts on leadership. So traditional hierarchical, sort of leadership structures in traditional organizations, some say are a thing of the past, and we need to think about new models of leadership just like we think of new forms of organizations. And that is what the next gen will be expecting. So maybe there are many who embrace that. I don't know. I think some of us fear it a little bit too. So either of those questions or both of them, over to you guys.
I think that those very good questions. I think that for my institution, the struggle will be to remain relevant. The fact is that we are a community foundation, and traditionally community foundations have been defined by being place-based organizations, but we're seeing with Silicon Valley, for example, the disruptor for my field, that place is no longer the central factor that it used to be, and they're much more willing to meet donors where they are. So how do we do that? We sell that we are experts on the best nonprofits in the New York area, and we're now being expected to become experts on a lot of other ways of giving, a lot of other places, and I think that's a real challenge for us. How do we continue to be a relevant community foundation for New York and build an endowment to meet the needs of the people of this region when donors are all over? And I'm going to turn it to someone else.
No, I think that that's a great point. I think I would just add that.
Sorry.
Oh, no.
Good question. Good questions.
That again, this is an opportunity for institutional organizations or for place-based organizations to engage in conversation with the next gen and to ask them what they're looking for and what are the metrics that they can show them, or what are the changes they're looking for, so that we're not sort of making decisions about how we evolve in a vacuum. The next gen is looking to be engaged in these conversations. I think that This is actually what I ended up going back to grad school to study. So I spent about 8 years in the sector before going back to grad school to study generational trends in philanthropy, and specifically how those will affect institutional organizations who have often a little bit more of a challenge demonstrating the sort of impact that the next gen are looking for them to communicate. But it really just all comes back to being in conversation with the next generation, not developing those metrics or those change ideas or thoughts in a vacuum, but asking them how you can demonstrate the sorts of opportunities to evolve or strategies to evolve in conversation.
I've had several opportunities in different roles that I've been in to have to answer this question about relevance. And I think my answer to the question, Rana, is that there's plenty to go around. I certainly cannot sit here and speak for all Nextgen donors or what they might be interested in giving in. And as a native New Yorker, I still see the value in organizations like the Trust and the foundation that I work for is committed to to the local community and give it back to the local community, and that as a donor is important to me. And I think very much of what Adina has shared is about how you have to look at each of these donors as individuals. Like, every person cares about different things, all their experiences, all of these things, their lives inform what they give to. So as much as, and I know how much work that is for folks who are trying to fundraise, but really, because of that relationship is so important, there's really no way to avoid that when you're having these conversations and asking what is important to you. And ultimately, as nonprofits and philanthropic organizations who are fundraising, you're gonna have to do the best you can with the information you have and try to appeal to the widest array of potential donors. So you won't be able to make everyone happy, essentially, but you do the best you can, and the best way to do that is to actually have the conversations and listen to what you're being told. I think the other issue is that folks make all sorts of assumptions about what Nextgeners are interested in. I live on my iPhone, so technology is important to me. And having a platform where I can give online is important, but that doesn't mean that I don't know how to write a check or like I'm not willing to give that way either. So I just want to be careful about like how we engage with folks and what assumptions we're making about this population.
I think you're right in saying that it's very important that we have the conversation and actually listen to each other, because I think that's a point that can easily get lost. I mean, the fact is we are talking about generations, but generations are composed of individuals, right. And each individual is, of course, different. And you don't want to make such broad assumptions about the individual because they are part of a generation that you don't hear what they're saying and you can't be responsive to what they're telling you their needs are.
And I think, sorry if I may just for 1 second, jump in to say that we talk a lot about values, right, and what individuals value, what institutions value. How many of you in the room have had the experience of actually sorting between your values and having to communicate about, say, your top 3 values, right? Essentially, when we're talking about values, right, we're talking about decisions between right and right. There's no bad value. We just prioritize our values in the way that we in ways that matter to us today. And then those perhaps are the values that we use to define how we choose to engage with organizations. Organizations also have to prioritize their values and think about which values they want to communicate to the next generation. And I think what we've seen in our work that's so interesting, we talk a lot about the next generation and how it can actually be quite paralyzing to be a next-gen donor and inheritor to tremendous wealth. We talk about the paralysis by the 3 Ps: prosperity, predecessor, and possibility. Like, upon whose shoulders do you stand? You're inheriting values too. You're inheriting a legacy that you often feel an obligation to steward forward, but you have your own identity. And there's so much possibility of how you choose to engage and how you want to engage. And one of the best ways to start to narrow down what your opportunities are to start to think strategically about what are your values, what are the top 3, how do you communicate about them, how do you have a conversation about them. And then what I think we're finding more and more, that's at least been surprising to me in this work, specifically on the consulting side, is that oftentimes when you take the time to sort your values, some of the values that come up are really similar to institutional organizations. For example, community comes up often for Nextgen as a top value, and community is often what institutional organizations, especially place-based organizations, are looking to create for Nextgen. And so there's really an opportunity to think about shifting the nature of conversations and to take the time to think about the more meta level as a way to engage.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions. We're going to get to as many of them as we can right now, and I'm going to combine a couple of them. There are several questions asking, how should organizations educate the next gen of their donor base about them? Are there inexpensive ways to do that? Should they put people on a board? Should they have an advisory board that's full of young people? Are there particular tech tactics that would be, the golden bullet, and that would be the thing that would bring the next generation to them? So from any of those points of view, what would your advice be?
All of the above. I wasn't sure if that was like on the paper or if you were riffing, but I hope you guys took that down. I think for me, obviously, also like a lot of the places that I donate to, I'm informed by the work that I do in my day job. But social media is always a place to do that. Just share what's going on, how to effectively use hashtags, and I think also you have just opportunities to open the space up and have these conversations. Like if you're in a community, you want to invite young folks who are living or working in that community, and you're interested in engaging with them, hosting just a conversation where you have if you're a philanthropic organization, invite some of your grantees. If you're a nonprofit organization, some of your members or constituents to just talk about the work that you do, why it's important, and where they can fit in. That's where we start. It doesn't have to be reinventing the wheel here.
I totally agree. And I also think, particularly when it comes to the technology aspect, by becoming much more savvy and using social media effectively, you're not going to turn off your older donors. Right. The fact is, we're all connected now. We all use technology in ways that many of us never thought we would. So actually, it's going to help you just do what you do better for many different generations. And it's probably the best way to have a more multi-generational approach.
A couple of very specific questions. First, do people have ideas about the new tax law and the challenges that's going to raise, particularly with a new generation of people that we want to get in the habit of giving money to charity? So any thoughts about that? And I'll just put that one out first, and then I'll come to another specific one.
I think from our perspective, we have to keep reminding ourselves that it seems like people give for tax-driven reasons, but people really often don't give for tax-driven reasons. They give because they care passionately about a cause, or they give because it's part of their value system to tithe or something like that, or because someone who they care about has asked them to make a contribution. Those reasons are not going away just because the tax law has changed. And I know there's a lot of emphasis on how eliminating the charitable deduction for most people will really affect the nonprofit's baseline. But I think it's just an opportunity for us to go back to the fundamentals, and fundamentals are cultivation, getting to know the donor, and making your case.
I'll say this really quickly. I was just having this conversation recently because most of the folks that I know don't actually claim their donations on their taxes, so this is not something that they're worried about at all. And a lot of folks are still donating through like crowdsourcing and GoFundMe and those sorts of things, and those don't count anyway, but people are giving it because they're connected to these stories and want to make an impact, even if it's on a very individual, small case. So, but I'm also not a person of wealth. That's the bucket that Adina works for it, so maybe they're more concerned about it. But I just wanted to offer that as we don't often look at people who give to crowdsourcing as philanthropists, but they are just as much as the rest of us.
Good. You don't need to add anything unless you want to on that.
No, I would just say that I think I agree with everything that was just mentioned, especially this idea that there are so many reasons to give outside of tax incentives. And I think especially when we talk about the next generation being values-driven and impact-oriented, I think the next generation feels like there's an opportunity for them to really lead now We convene a network of Nextgen funders. We bring them together for twice annually for ongoing learning, philanthropic identity exploration, and all that. And it's interesting the way that this conversation is coming up in this context, where we find a lot of Nextgen saying this is our opportunity to step up, because we're able to really highlight the things that we care about, especially in the context of family philanthropy, and bringing that conversation to their family, and maybe thinking in a different way about why they are engaging with the causes that they are currently engaged with.
Two very specific questions, and I'm going to just ask one of you to answer each one of them. First, what is a giving circle, and is that something that is more popular with the Nextgen, or has it been around for a long time and I just don't know? Fair enough question. And maybe Adina, you can answer that quickly. And then the next question was donor advised funds. Are those more popular for the next generation? And if they are, how should nonprofits get to them? And Gay, that will be for you. So one each.
Sure.
Short answer, because then we want to do one round robin for all of you.
Absolutely. So giving circles are just this idea of collective giving, where groups of individuals pool their funding so that their collective funding can have a bigger impact. This is very, very popular with Nextgen. More and more, I find that that's what I'm spending a lot of my time doing, is going in and facilitating giving circles. I think the unique opportunity of a giving circle, other than the fact that when you pool your resources, you can have a bigger impact because you have a bigger pot to work from, is that there's a lot of education that is involved in a giving circle. So when you're making collective decisions, then you have to take 10 steps back and talk about what does the group value, where is their alignment, where are their differences, what are our top values, what are our bottom values, which is always a really interesting conversation, because for some, their top value is somebody else's bottom value, and it just lends to a really rich conversation. How do we want to measure impact? So really successful giving circles are actually really an opportunity to really educate around philanthropy, and they take time. You meet over the course of whatever amount of time you have, typically something like a year. Learn about the organizations that are being considered for your gift, for your collective gift. Learn about how you want to give together collectively, and then ultimately make a decision, and then track the impact as a community. So certainly something that we're seeing become more trending a lot in our work.
Donor advised funds are popular across the board. It's a multi-generational charitable giving vehicle. So I can't say that they're more popular with Nextgen than they are with baby boomers. I mean, the fact is there's $87 billion sitting in donor advised funds, so obviously someone really likes them. The other thing is I just think that, you have to make your case, and there's no magic bullet. The fact is, if you're not making your case effectively, it doesn't matter if the money's in a donor advised fund or if it's a foundation grant that you're going after. You are in the best position to explain who you are and what you do better than anyone else, and that's how you make connections with donors.
So then one more quick question before you each have your final comments, and this one's for Bianca. Can you give me some pet peeves for next generation? For example, when a nonprofit board is not diverse, when a website is poorly done, what are the pet peeves?
Okay, so
Your
now
top three.
Yeah, that's hard because it's like Bianca's pet peeves versus like EPIP members' pet peeves. I'm not sure what to share here. I will say these things from our membership. Feeling like you're being tokenized, so you're in the room, but just to be in the room, but your voice, your experience, none of that matters. You're just supposed to be there to exist. That's a big pet peeve for folks in our membership. I would say the second one is not being seen as a resource. And that has to do with kind of the lack of kind of internal institutional workplace culture where you feel like our members feel like they're not being tapped by senior management for potential promotions or when they're to inform their work or kind of where they see, especially during strategic planning processes where we have all these folks who are there and not being asked at all or are part of those tables. That's a big pet peeve. And I would say the last one is Probably the idea of or having to listen to conversations where people are talking about you without including you as a part of it. That happens a lot. The idea that you're sitting in a room or in a board meeting or you're taking notes or at a staff meeting and folks are talking about either the communities that you come from or your actual like next geners as a generation, and making all sorts of assumptions and being present in the space and almost feeling like invisible and not able to inform any of the ways that the organization is approaching these populations that you belong to.
Thank you. So now I'm going to ask each of you to give a single piece of advice, just one, to traditional nonprofits who know and need and want to make sure that both for their employees and their donors, that they are exciting and welcoming to the next generation. We'll start with Gay and just come right down.
I think we just need to try and see each other as individuals. So I would say just be a little more patient and tolerant of the people around you, because everybody wants to be recognized as an individual and unique in that respect. And I think that goes to what Bianca's saying, and I think it goes to when you're trying to reach across generational lines, just try and see the person that you're talking to.
So my comment will be more for institutions that our folks work for. I would just say pay your people, take care of them. They have that institutional knowledge. You want to keep them, and also realize that their internal experiences at the organization is also informing their giving, and they're sharing those informations with the other folks that they're connected to. So even if you have a flashy mission and you're doing good work, if you don't take care of your people, we know. And we don't want to give it to you. I'm just saying.
I love that. That's tough to beat. I would say maybe just ask great questions. Like, I think that I might sound like a broken record, and I've said that a bunch of times already here today, but it's really about getting to know who the next generation is. One of the best ways to do that actually is really old school. It's to like paste a poster up somewhere or take out a whiteboard, draw like a stick figure. Think about who is the next gen you're looking to engage. What are the events and conditions that they live through? Really take the time to think empathically about that generation, who you're looking to engage, and how might that have informed the observable characteristics that you think that you see about the next generation. So rather than saying next gen are entitled or next gen are whatever, take the time to think about like what they lived through. And actually a great exercise to do across the generations, because we carry a lot of assumptions about the traditional generation too and the boomer generation. And so great exercises to think a little bit about what are the events and conditions that they lived through, how do we build empathy for the generations, how do we make sure that the character traits that we think about when we think about the different generations are really coming from an informed place, and start to break down assumptions a little bit so that we can work more effectively in a multi-generational way.
Wow. So I think that you all have gotten some great advice from this multi-generational panel up here in front of you. And I'm going to add one word to what they all just said, and that word is relationships. Relationships matter in each and every generation, and some of the traditional ways of connecting with people, making sure they know you and understand your work and what you care about, and that you know the same for them, that actually does matter. So please join me in thanking the panel for great insights.
Thank you so much. The message is loud and clear. It's new, but it's not. It's cyclical, isn't it? I mean, for some of us in the room, we identify with some of the things that have been said at different stages of our careers, but everything changes based on the world in which we're living in now. So in many ways, the things that have been said are very fresh. And so I want to thank you all for that.